when the armies of Kufa met Ibn Zubayr, Bujair ibn Abdullah al-Musli spoke. Praise be to God who has tested us with shackles and tested you by your forgiving us. Ibn Zubayr, we are people who turn to the same Qibla as you.
What a strange phrase. We are the people who turn to the same Qibla as you. Muslim historians argue that this means the same Qibla as every other Muslim. But now that we have uncovered evidence of the change of Qibla at this very time, this phrase takes on special significance. The people of Kufa join with Ibn Zubayr in accepting his Qibla. This is key to understanding much of what takes place later. Even though Ibn Zubayr is eventually killed and seems to lose the civil war, the city of Kufa plays a major role in the development of the new Abbasid dynasty, and Kufa becomes a theological center and a place for copying Qurans.
In the Islamic world, things were a mess. Not only were Muslims divided politically, they were divided religiously. Obeying the wishes of Allah as revealed by the Prophet Muhammad was at the very heart of Islam. Should you obey Muhammad and the Quran and face towards the forbidden gathering place in Petra? Or should you pray towards the sacred house and the Black Rock, which is in Saudi Arabia? So far, Dan Gibson has plotted the existing mosques from the 1st century of Islam, and they all point to Petra in Jordan. So what about the mosques of the 2nd century of Islam? Do they all point to Petra as well?
Here is where things start to get interesting. During my studies, I discovered that the mosques built during the 2nd century of Islam point in different directions. This is what I call the time of confusion.
102 years after the founding of Islam, the Mosque of Ummah was constructed in southern Syria, in the ancient city of Busra. As you can see, the mosque's orientation does not point towards Mecca. But clearly, it does not point to Petra either.
5 years later, the ruling Muslims built a palace in the Syrian deserts known as Qasr al-Hayar al-Gharbi. This is a drawing of the floor plan of the palace and the mosque in the corner of the complex. The whole complex seems to face somewhere between Petra and Mecca.
A couple of years later, Qasr al-Hayar-i-Shaki Palace was built about 100 kilometers north of Palmyra. If we examine the ground plan of the palace buildings, we notice that the palace and its mosque don't seem to align to either Mecca or Petra. Once again, it points in between. Is it possible that something had happened which made the builders not want to choose either Petra or Mecca, so they pointed the Qibla between the two? We can see from the map that the Qibla points exactly between the two cities. It is not a slight error in calculation, but a deliberate avoiding of both Petra and Mecca. So, we must find an answer elsewhere to explain that change.
109 years after the founding of Islam, a mosque was built in Bangalore, Pakistan. Like all of the other mosques of the period, it had only a Qibla wall without a niche. This mosque, however, pointed towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
Here we have the very first mosque that we can identify as pointing to Mecca. There may have been others built that no longer exist, but this mosque is significant because it's the earliest surviving mosque that we can truly say faced Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And what is astounding is that it was built about 100 years after the death of Muhammad. This is very late for Muslim historians, and it is going to cause traditional Islamic history all kinds of trouble.
One of the most important buildings in our study is found here on the citadel of Amman, Jordan. This Umayyad palace was built about 122 years after the founding of Islam. Now, if you remember, we looked at an Umayyad mosque built over here. This mosque points directly towards Petra. But when they built the palace, its Qibla direction was directly towards Mecca. So clearly, the Qibla direction changed sometime between the construction of those buildings and the construction of this palace. This will help us determine how and when the Qibla direction changed. Remember, it was during the construction of this palace that the name Mecca first appears in literature anywhere.
الغريب أن مكة لم تذكر طول هالسنين هذه لا في الكتب الأدبية ولا الكتب الإسلامية، ولكن ما تم ذكرها إلا عند تغيير القبلة، وهذا شيء غريب جدا. يا ترى شنو الأسباب؟ يعني المفروض أنه يذكر حتى في الكتب الإسلامية في تاريخ الإسلام، ولكن لم يذكر هذا الشيء إلا عند تغيير القبلة. هذا شيء غريب.
The next major mosque that was constructed was built 32 kilometers south of Amman, Jordan. This was known as the Mushatta Palace and Mosque, and it was built in 743 AD. As you can see, it was a very large and impressive Umayyad palace, with the mosque located in the southern part of the structure, facing Petra. Indeed, the entire complex faces Petra. What makes this interesting is that it seems that Islam is now split into several groups. There were the traditionalists who built their mosques like this one, facing Petra. But there were reformers whose mosques face Mecca. And there were others who were not in either group, and they refused to select either of those qiblas.
During this time, a significant change took place in Islamic history. The Umayyad rulers of Islam in Damascus were defeated by the Abbasids of Kufa. In 754 AD, Al-Mansur, the new caliph, commissioned the construction of a brand new eastern capital, choosing Baghdad in Iraq as his site.
The new city was built on a spectacular design. Rather than the haphazard shape common to most Middle Eastern cities, this city was built in a great circle. The designers went out to a brand new area and used ashes to draw out the city plan on the ground prior to construction. The city, which was completed in 767 AD, was 2 kilometers in diameter. As you can see on this drawing, the main mosque of the city had no niche indicating the direction of prayer. That was to come later. One wall was used as a Qibla wall, and that wall pointed directly to Mecca, as would all of the other mosques built from now on by the Abbasid rulers.
If this is all true, then the Prophet Muhammad and the first 4 rightly guided caliphs in Islam, and the following Umayyad rulers who ruled Islam from Damascus, all prayed towards the city of Petra. But late in the Umayyad reign, something happened that caused the builders to change the direction of their mosques. Some pointed to Petra, some to Mecca, and some chose to be neutral and point between the two. This created a problem for the western half of Islam. The people in the West were still loyal to the earlier Umayyads. So the Islamic world is now split into two. The Abbasid rulers in Iraq control the eastern part of the empire, and the Umayyad rulers control North Africa and Spain. This is an important time in Islamic history, because the Umayyads in Spain now blossom in culture and begin to build beautiful and impressive buildings. The builders in Spain had a problem. Traditionally, Umayyads all prayed towards Petra. But, as we're going to see, something devastating happened, resulting in future mosques no longer facing that direction. Their enemies, the Abbasids, now pray towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia, so they don't want to choose that direction of prayer. So what should the Umayyads do?
As I examined the mosques built by the Spanish Umayyads, I discovered a most surprising development. These builders chose neither Petra nor Mecca. Now, as we have seen, some of the builders in the Middle East chose to point their qiblas between the two cities. But the builders in North Africa and Spain decided to do something completely different. Over the years, historians have always been puzzled by these mosques. Their qiblas seem to point towards somewhere in South Africa, but all of the African and Spanish mosques point to slightly different places. It all seems very confusing. However, when plotted on a map, we can see that the mosques of North Africa and Spain all have qiblas that are parallel to a line drawn between Petra and Mecca. So rather than choosing Petra or Mecca, they chose to make their qiblas parallel to a line drawn between the two cities.
كل المسلمين يعرفون بأن مكة موجودة في السعودية، وأنت في نظريتك اليوم يعني تقول لي مكة موجودة في البتراء، على أي أساس أنت جبت هذا الفكرة؟ يعني شنو الدليل؟ شنو البرهان هذا؟ يعني برهانك ودليلك على هذا الشيء؟ احنا اللي عارفين أن مكة موجودة في السعودية، فعلى أي أساس أنت جبت هذا الشيء؟
If you're still not convinced, I want to show you something else. Do you remember when we discussed the Second Islamic Civil War? Ibn Zubair barricaded himself in the Holy City, and the Umayyad Syrian army surrounded him and kept him there for 4 months. During the month of October, the Syrians brought a catapult up to the city walls, where they lobbed rocks right into the holy places of Islam. How is this possible? Normally, people live behind the city walls. A catapult would simply smash down people's houses. But in this case, it said the catapult hit the holy places of Islam right in the center of the city. How is this possible? Well, here in Petra, there is a unique feature. Petra had city walls. In the north and in the south, the city walls crossed the valley. But in the north, the city walls did not go all the way to the canyon because there was a watercourse running along the canyon. I believe the Syrians brought their catapult up the dry river course right to the place where they could lob rocks into the very heart of the city, hitting the Kaaba and the holy places of Islam.
Archaeologists from Brown University have been digging here in Petra for many years. Their project was to excavate what is known as the Great Temple area. As they uncovered the temple, Dan was amazed to find evidence that supported his theory.
One of the interesting features of this building is that people built defenses here against attack. See here in this doorway, they closed it in so they could defend themselves. This happened sometime after the earthquake of 551 AD. We can date the defenses of here by the roofing tiles that were used in the construction of these defenses. However, there are no recorded battles in Petra during this time. So we know this happened during the founding years of Islam. But this is not the only evidence we have. During the excavations, the archaeologists uncovered over 400 catapult stones. These stones are buried in about the right place at exactly the right time. This is an extremely strong indication that the battle took place here and that the first original Kaaba was close to this location.
So, Islam was divided between the traditionalists and the reformers. The traditionalists prayed towards Petra in Jordan, and the reformers prayed towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia, and others deliberately choosing a middle path. How were they ever going to solve this dilemma? Petra, the city of weeping, suffered a fatal calamity. Massive earthquakes shook the Petra region, destroying buildings, temples, and houses. The damage was so bad that the city was never rebuilt again.
The evidence for that first Kaaba is gone now. The catapult stones destroyed much of it. Ibn Zubair destroyed the rest. In 713, an earthquake destroyed the dam that diverts the water around Petra. So every year, floodwaters washed away whatever evidence was left.
So, with the memory of Petra fading from view, the chroniclers of Islamic history, writing some 150 years later, would never mention it by name. In time, the memories of these two locations became merged into one, that of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. From now on, all Qiblas would point here. It wasn't until modern archaeological tools, satellite photos, and the internet allowed the networking of historians, academics, and scholars around the world to start piecing together a different picture.
هذا الأمر غريب، يعني أول مرة نسمع فيه، يعني شلون المسلمين تبيهم يصدقون في هذا الشيء المكتوب؟ يعني غريبة، ليش ما مذكور في الكتب الإسلامية ولا مذكور في كتب التاريخ؟ شلون نسوا ولا يعني يا ترى هل تناسوا ولا نسوا هذا الأمر؟ شلون ما ذكروه؟ شيء غريب.
In order to understand the events that influenced the writing of Islamic history, we need to recognize several things. First, it is my belief there was a literary vacuum in the early Islamic empire, created by zealous Muslims who destroyed books and manuscripts, erased inscriptions, burned libraries, and destroyed all literature except the Quran, which was mostly bits and pieces of what people remembered of the revelations that Muhammad gave. This destruction of written material by the Islamic forces has been well documented. One piece of evidence is a letter from 640 AD from the Caliph to General Amru, the leader of the Muslim armies in Egypt, who asked the Caliph what should he do with the thousands of manuscripts he found in warehouses in Alexandria. The Caliph's answer has been recorded and known for centuries.
As for the books you mention, here is my reply. If their content is in accordance with the revelations of Allah, we may do without them, for in that case the revelations of Allah more than suffice. If on the other hand, they contain matter not in accordance with the revelations of Allah, there can be no need to preserve them. Proceed then and destroy them.
The Muslim writer Ibn al-Kifti tells us that the books were distributed to the public baths of Alexandria, where they were used to feed the stoves, which kept the baths comfortably warm.
They say it took 6 months to burn all that mass of material.
Eutychius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, recorded that there were 4,000 baths that received books from the Alexandrian library.
This burning of books, however, did not start in Egypt, but 4 years earlier in Persia. Caliph Umar's army met with the Persian armies in the Battle of Qadisiyah in the year 636 AD. In early January 637, the Muslim advance guard reached the outskirts of Ctesiphon and laid siege to the city for 2 months. Eventually the city fell and the Muslims occupied it. During the fighting, the palaces and the library at Ctesiphon were deliberately burned. In the end, the only book that managed to survive in Arabia was the glorious Quran.
When it comes to the history of the Quran, historians have struggled. It seems that most of the Quran was retained in an oral fashion rather than written form. While the Arabs were great memorizers and had the ability to retain the entirety of the Quran, the retention of materials in an oral tradition suffers from several difficulties. First, the accuracy of the memories of the individuals involved must be perfect. In the case of the Quran, arguments arose over the various verses, how they should be rendered, and if they should or should not be included in the whole. Second, the problem of transferring knowledge from the learned to the novice is often a difficult step. In the case of the Quran, most of the men who memorized the sayings of Muhammad were also warriors. As is often the case, warriors die in battle, and their knowledge of the Quran perished with them. This is amply illustrated in the Battle of Yamama, when an estimated 450 men who had memorized the Quran were killed.
Hudayfa bin al-Yaman came to Uthman at the time when the people of Damascus and the people of Iraq were waging war to conquer Armenia and Azerbaijan. Hudayfa was afraid because the people of Damascus and Iraq had differences in the recitation of the Quran. So he said to Uthman, "O chief of the believers, save this nation before they differ about the revelations." So Uthman sent a message to Hafsa saying, "Send us your manuscript of the Quran so that we may compile the Quranic materials into perfect copies and return the manuscript to you." Hafsa sent it. Then a group of men sat down to create a new copy of the Quran. Uthman said to the 3 Quraysh men, "In case you disagree, write it in the dialect of Quraysh, for the Quran was revealed in their tongue."
When several copies were written, Uthman returned the original manuscript to Hafsa. Uthman then sends every Muslim province 1 copy of what's been written, and he orders that all of the Quranic material, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or even in whole copies, that they all be burned.
And so the burning continued. This time, even Quranic materials were burnt. But it did not stop the arguing about what should or should not be included in the Quran. When the new Qurans arrived in various provinces, people argued against them.
Sa'id bin Thabit said, a verse from Surah Al-Ahzab was missed when we copied the Quran, and I used to hear Allah's apostle reciting it. So we searched for it and found it with Husayma bin Thabit al-Ansari.
These 5 or 6 copies were now the only Qurans in the entire Muslim empire. Uthman's order to burn all other Quranic material tried to wipe out all Qurans everywhere, except the few that were held by the provincial governors.
In effect, all non-Muslim books were destroyed, and then the Muslims destroyed all of their own books and writings, except for 5 or 6 copies. Remember, the Islamic Empire at this time stretched from the Atlantic Ocean through the Middle East all the way to Afghanistan, and only 5 or 6 copies of the Quran existed in all those millions of square kilometers. This is what I refer to when I speak of a literary vacuum. Much later, once the Abbasids took control of the Islamic Empire, they recognized this literary vacuum and they set out to correct it. The problem was, they were interested in producing an Abbasid version of Islamic history. So all of the materials produced under the Abbasid control reflected the politically correct version of Abbasid history. These histories and hadiths about the previous 250 or more years were collected, copied, and distributed. Those books that were written earlier were either destroyed or edited by later writers who thought they found errors in them.
Under Abbasid rule, massive religious, scientific, and academic projects were undertaken. The Abbasid rulers encouraged scholarly development that would not only present the early years of Islam in a good light, but would also confirm their own right to ruling the empire.
During this period of time, we find the great Islamic historians writing their treatise on Islamic history. And they also edit the earlier accounts. For example, we don't have Ibn Ishaq's original biography of Muhammad, as Ibn Hisham, under the Abbasids, corrected what he called grievous errors in the original account.
After the editing of Ibn Hisham, the rest of the great Islamic historians began to write their histories, and they present us with an Islamic history that was tailored to suit the religious and political worldview of the Abbasids of their day. Is it possible that Muslims today are victims of an Abbasid cover-up? Did the Abbasids purposely turn Muslims away from praying towards the forbidden gathering place in Petra, as the Quran commands, and make them pray towards the Black Rock, now residing in Mecca? Are Muslims still being misled by Abbasid propaganda? I believe the stage was set when early Muslim leaders gathered together the various scraps of the Quran. The problem wasn't the collection, it was the destruction of anything that opposed their view.
There is a great divide here between Western thought and Muslim thought. In Western thought, the later manuscripts are less reliable, as they are copies of copies. We need to go back to earlier source material, as it's more accurate. Muslims, on the other hand, think earlier manuscripts are less reliable, and later manuscripts replace earlier manuscripts. Even in the Quran, later revelations replace or abrogate earlier revelations. Once you allow the concept of abrogation, you open yourself up to accepting all kinds of changes.
If the Abbasids tampered with history, did they go so far as tampering with the text of the Quran? For instance, how did the name Mecca get into Surah 48? Abu Bakr, the successor of Muhammad, made the first compilation of Quranic material. Uthman, who followed him, used that collection and then added to it. The historians tell us that even after Uthman had compiled his Quran, people remembered still more verses that Muhammad had revealed. Every time a new Quran came out, it was touted as the most complete Quran. The previous ones were okay, but the newer ones were more complete, with more revelations in them. Did the Abbasids bring out an even more complete Quran that contained mention of Mecca? Today we have many of the Abbasid Kufi Qurans in museums from Istanbul to Samarkand. These Qurans use the Kufic script invented in the city of Kufa. But what about earlier Qurans written in other scripts? I have searched through many of the early Quranic parchments written in pre-Kufic script. It should come as no surprise that none of the pre-Kufic material includes verses about the changing of the Qibla or the city of Mecca. Historians have challenged me that I'm trying to rewrite all of Islamic history. I assure you I'm not trying to do this. I'm only suggesting one small change. Long ago, the holy city of Islam was referred to as Becca. I believe that name was used for the city of Petra after repeated earthquakes killed many people. After Ibn Zubair moved the Black Stone to Mecca, scribes had only to make one small change to Islamic writing. In Arabic, Becca is written like this. It's very easy to change the ba to a meme. Watch again. That's all it took. It is virtually undetectable to later readers. Did the Abbasid scribes correct an earlier reference to Becca in the Quran and make it into Mecca? I believe that all of the evidence points to Petra as being the ancient city of Becca, the founding place of Islam. All of the mosques of the first century of Islam point to the forbidden gathering place in Petra, and all of the descriptions fit Petra, not Mecca. Muslims are instructed in the Quran to pray towards the forbidden gathering place. The Quran says nothing about the Black Rock.
It is clear that although Dan Gibson's research is rooted in Islamic history, and he has a great affection for the Arabic world, his theories will be challenging to Muslims. As faiths around the globe come under increasing scrutiny to prove the veracity of their origins, all religions need to consider serious research they may find difficult. Islam needs to ask if it is possible that over 1 billion people have been misled by Abbasid propaganda regarding how and where their religion began. And, if true, what implications does this have for the average Muslim today?